The moving truck disappeared around the corner, leaving only the echo of diesel fumes and broken promises. Sarah Martinez stood in the doorway of what the realtor had called a steal of a deal. A 4-bedroom colonial in the kind of town where neighbors still waved and children rode bikes until sunset. The price had been too good to be true, slashed by 60% from similar properties just one county over. But as she watched her 8-year-old daughter Emma press her face against the upstairs window, Sarah felt something cold crawl up her spine, something that had nothing to do with the October air. The previous owners had left in the middle of the night. The realtor had mentioned casually something about a family emergency. What he hadn't mentioned was the newspaper clipping still tucked behind the basement water heater, dated 6 months earlier. Local family of 4, still missing after mysterious disappearance. Sarah would find that clipping in 3 days, along with the scratches on the inside of the bedroom closet doors and the words carved into the basement wall. They watch from the woods. But Sarah's story is just one of 7 families who thought they were moving toward their American dream, only to discover they had relocated to someone else's living nightmare. Tonight, you'll hear the testimonies of ordinary people who made one simple decision: to pack up their lives and start fresh in small-town America, only to find themselves trapped in situations so terrifying, so bizarre, and so utterly real that Hollywood couldn't have scripted them. These aren't urban legends passed down through generations or ghost stories told around campfires. These are documented cases, police reports, court testimonies, and medical records of families who discovered that sometimes the reason a place seems too good to be true is because it's built on a foundation of secrets that should have stayed buried. From underground fires that have burned for decades to cults masquerading as community leaders. From toxic waste dumps hidden beneath playgrounds to towns where the very act of being different makes you a target. These 7 true stories will make you question everything you think you know about small-town safety and the communities we trust to raise our children. Story 1. The Midnight Bells of Centralia. Pennsylvania. Mike and Jennifer Thompson had lived in cramped Philadelphia apartments their entire married life, dreaming of the day they could give their children the kind of childhood they remembered from their own small-town upbringings. When Mike's construction company landed a contract in nearby Ashland, they saw it as divine intervention, an opportunity to escape the city's chaos and find something real, something wholesome. The internet listing for 412 Locust Street in Centralia seemed like a miracle. A 3-bedroom colonial with hardwood floors, a wraparound porch, and mature oak trees that would be perfect for the tire swing 6-year-old David had been begging for. At $37,000, it cost less than their annual rent. And the photos showed a quaint main street with a few local businesses, and the kind of neighborhood where children could ride their bikes unsupervised. What struck Jennifer first when they arrived for the walkthrough wasn't the house itself, but the silence. Centralia felt frozen in time, with perfectly maintained streets but no traffic, manicured lawns but no people. The realtor, a nervous man named Carl, who kept checking his watch, explained that the town had experienced some population decline but assured them it was simply economic migration. Young people heading to bigger cities for opportunities. He rushed them through the inspection, glossing over the hairline cracks in the basement walls and the faint odor that seemed to permeate the lower level. When Jennifer asked about the smell, Carl laughed it off as old house character and quickly ushered them upstairs to admire the crown molding. The seller had left suddenly, he explained. Something about a job opportunity that couldn't wait, which was why everything was being sold fully furnished at such an incredible price. The Thompsons signed the papers that afternoon, convinced they had stumbled into the kind of deal that would let them provide their children with the childhood every parent dreams of giving. Moving day arrived in early September, and the autumn air carried promise, along with the changing leaves. David immediately claimed the tire swing that hung from the massive oak in their backyard, while baby Emma gurgled contentedly in her carrier. As Jennifer unpacked boxes in the kitchen, Mike marveled at the solid construction of their new home, the thick walls and sturdy floors that had been built to last generations. But as the days turned into weeks, small details began to accumulate into a pattern of unease that none of them could quite articulate. The basement stayed unusually warm, even as October temperatures dropped, and that faint sulfurous odor seemed strongest near the foundation walls. David's persistent cough, which they had attributed to seasonal allergies, showed no signs of improving. despite multiple doctor visits and prescription inhalers. Baby Emma, who had been sleeping through the night since she was 3 months old, began waking multiple times with inexplicable crying fits that would last for hours. The first real sign that something was seriously wrong came when their cat, Whiskers, refused to enter the basement at all, hissing and backing away whenever anyone tried to carry him downstairs. Then the cracks appeared. Not the settling cracks that old houses develop over time, but angry fissures that seemed to spread across their basement walls like lightning frozen in concrete. Mike tried to patch them with standard basement sealant, but within days they had reopened, longer and wider than before. The smell grew stronger, and with it came an oppressive heat that made the basement feel like a furnace, even when the outside temperature dropped below freezing. When their heating bills arrived, showing usage that defied explanation, their gas bill was actually lower than their Philadelphia apartment. Despite heating a much larger space, Jennifer began researching their new town's history online. What she found in the digital archives of the local newspaper made her blood run cold. Article after article from the early 1980s told the story of a town in crisis. Families evacuating in the middle of the night. Government buyout programs. Environmental disaster declarations. The coal fire that had started in 1962, when the volunteer fire department tried to clean up the town dump by burning it, had spread through the maze of abandoned mine shafts that honeycombed the ground beneath Centralia. The fire had been burning for over 20 years by the time most residents realized the scope of the disaster, consuming everything in its underground path and creating sinkholes that could swallow entire sections of roadway without warning. By 1990, the federal government had relocated nearly 1,000 residents, demolishing their homes and leaving behind a ghost town where the very ground was slowly being consumed by an unstoppable inferno. Jennifer's hands shook as she scrolled through contemporary articles about carbon monoxide poisoning, ground temperatures that reached over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit just feet below the surface, and children who had developed respiratory problems from breathing toxic gases that seeped through basement walls. She found photographs of roads cracked open like broken eggs, revealing the hellish glow of fire burning in the depths below, and testimonies from families who had lost everything when their homes literally fell into the earth. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when she discovered that while most of Centralia had been evacuated and demolished, a handful of properties had been left standing due to legal disputes and bureaucratic delays. Their dream home wasn't just built on top of an underground coal fire. It was one of the last remaining structures in what was essentially an active volcano. When Mike came home that evening, Jennifer met him at the door, with printouts of everything she had found, her face pale and her voice barely above a whisper. They called the fire department immediately, and within an hour, Fire Chief Robert McNeil arrived at their door, with an expression that Jennifer would never forget. The look of someone who had seen too much tragedy and was about to witness more. He didn't need to test the air quality or measure ground temperatures. He could smell the sulfur and feel the heat radiating through their floorboards. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with genuine regret. "I thought everyone knew. This whole area is still active. The fire department has been monitoring it for decades, but there's nothing we can do to stop it. It's going to burn for another 200 years, maybe more. You need to evacuate tonight." He explained that carbon monoxide was likely seeping into their home through the foundation cracks, which explained David's respiratory problems and Emma's sleep disturbances. Prolonged exposure could cause permanent neurological damage or death, and the ground beneath their house could collapse without warning, as the fire consumed the coal seams that had once supported the surface. The Thompsons packed their belongings in the same rental truck they had used just 2 months earlier, but this time there was no excitement about new beginnings or fresh starts. They drove away from Centralia in the middle of the night, leaving behind their furniture, their dreams, and $37,000 they would never recover. As Mike looked in his rearview mirror one last time, he saw the faint orange glow emanating from cracks in the road behind them. Visible proof of the hell that continued to burn beneath what had once been a thriving American community. The house they had thought would provide their children with the perfect childhood had nearly killed them instead. And they joined the ranks of nearly 1,000 other families who had learned too late that some prices are too good to be true, because they're being paid for with other people's nightmares. Today, Centralia remains a ghost town where the fire still burns. A monument to the horror that can lurk beneath the most innocent-looking American dreams. Story to the synchronized smiles of Boulder Creek. Montanathon Clark's promotion was supposed to be the family's golden ticket. A fully remote executive role. A signing bonus that erased their debt, and most tempting of all, a farmhouse tucked into the pines outside Boulder Creek. The brochure showed frosted mountain peaks and a main street lined with hanging flower baskets. Every review he read called the place the safest town in Montana. The Clarks arrived on a bright June afternoon and were greeted by a line of neighbors who seemed to have choreographed the encounter. Identical pastel outfits. Identical church picnic smiles. Identical murmurs of, "We've been expecting you." It felt quaint until it felt wrong within a week. Ethan's 9-year-old son Ben noticed that the town's clocks chimed in perfect unison, even the ones in abandoned buildings. Their dog refused to pass the white wooden church at the edge of town, teeth bared at nothing. And every evening at 7:13 p.m. sharp, the residents gathered on their porches, faced west, and stood motionless for exactly 3 minutes. When Ethan asked why, the grocery clerk answered in a voice as flat as dial tone. "Discipline keeps us safe." The first overt warning came from Ava Mitchell, a waitress whose smile didn't quite match her eyes. She slipped Ben an origami crane made from a newspaper clipping. Survivalist cult builds dozens of bunkers near Yellowstone. On the back she had written, "They never left." That night, Ava disappeared. Her house stood dark, the porch swing still swaying. Ethan dug into county archives and discovered that Boulder Creek sat just 30 miles from the Royal Teton Ranch, once headquarters of the Church Universal and Triumphantan apocalyptic sect that funneled millions into underground shelters, stockpiled AR-15s, and convinced thousands to hide from a Soviet strike predicted for March 15, 1990. After the prophecy fizzled, most outsiders assumed the group dissolved, but property records showed shell companies all tracing back to former church officers buying every vacant home in Boulder Creek. Over the past decade, the town's Stepford-perfect demeanor now felt like a mask. Ethan's wife, Marissa, asked the PTA why every school field trip went inside the mountain rather than to the state park. A teacher whispered that Boulder Creek, academy marketed as a therapeutic wilderness school, was actually where the children of dissenters were, re-educated in isolation. A rumor echoed by former students online who described the program as one long indoctrination drill. On the Saturday of the summer festival, the Clarks learned what discipline really meant. At dusk, the mayor mounted the gazebo and announced, "Phase 7, sirens wailed." Porch lights blinked in Morse-like cadence. Residents ushered newcomers toward a tunnel hidden beneath the church. Ethan saw his neighbor's smile falter just long enough to reveal Terranot devotion. He grabbed his family and ran. They reached their truck as loudspeakers began a countdown. From 12, Ben looked back. Rows of townspeople filed underground, as if pulled by strings. Marissa turned the key. The engine stalled. Cut fuel line. 3, 2, 1. The church bell tolled, echoing against the valley walls like a mass heartbeat. Then the town went silent, utterly, impossibly silent. The Clarks abandoned the truck and hiked through 40 miles of wilderness, guided only by the distant glow of cell tower lights. When they reached a ranger station at dawn, park police treated them like survivors of a natural disaster. Blankets, oxygen, a notebook for statements. An officer admitted off-record that Boulder Creek wasn't on any current census. Whatever they're doing up there, they do it out of sight. Weeks later, Ethan received a certified letter, notice of property reclamation failure to participate in community protocol. No return address, no legal citation, just a postscript. Discipline keeps us safe. The family never retrieved their belongings. Satellite images now show the farmhouse leveled, replaced by a perfectly circular meadow. And every March 15th anniversary of the failed apocalypse, locals in surrounding counties swear they hear a bell ring exactly 7 times, carried on the wind from a town they can't find on any map. Story 3. The children who watched from the harvest. Gatlin, Nebraska. Carl and Betty Hendricks had spent 43 years in suburban Chicago, watching their neighbors' children grow up, while their own remained a dream deferred by infertility and failed adoptions. When Carl's disability pension finally came through after the factory accident, they decided to use their modest settlement to buy a small farm somewhere quiet. Somewhere they could tend a garden and maybe foster children who needed the kind of love they had been saving up for decades. The realtor in North Platte showed them photographs of a charming farmhouse in Gatlin, population 547, according to the 2010 census, with white clapboard siding, a red barn, and 20 acres of rich farmland perfect for growing vegetables. The price was remarkably reasonable, and the realtor explained that agricultural communities often offered great deals to attract new families, especially ones interested in becoming part of the local culture. What the realtor didn't mention was that the previous 3 families who had bought that particular property had left within 6 months, and that the town's population had somehow decreased by 37 people since the last official count. The Hendricks arrived on a crisp September morning when the corn was at its peak height, creating golden walls that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. The farmhouse was exactly as advertised, complete with wide front porches and the kind of kitchen windows that framed pastoral views, like living postcards. But it was the silence that struck Betty first, the absence of normal farm sounds like tractors, or dogs barking, or children playing. When she mentioned this to their nearest neighbor, Mrs. Brennan, the elderly woman's expression darkened before she forced a smile and explained that Gatlin was a very disciplined community, where children understood the importance of respectful behavior and adults appreciated the value of quiet contemplation. She invited them to attend the monthly Harvest Fellowship at the community center, where all new residents were expected to introduce themselves and learn about local traditions. It wasn't really optional, she added, with that same strained smile, because community participation was essential for maintaining the harmony that made Gatlin such a special place to raise children. The Harvest Fellowship was held in a converted grain silo that had been painted white and filled with folding chairs, arranged in perfect concentric circles. Every family in town seemed to be represented, but what disturbed Betty was the way the children sat perfectly still, with their hands folded in their laps, never fidgeting or whispering the way normal children do during adult gatherings. They ranged in age from perhaps 6 to 16, all dressed in identical earth-toned clothing that looked like it had been sewn from the same bolt of fabric. And they watched the adults with an intensity that made Betty's skin crawl. The town's unofficial leader, a tall man named Father Michael, who wasn't actually ordained by any recognized church, explained that Gatlin had been blessed with exceptionally well-behaved children because they understood their sacred role in the community's agricultural mission. The children, he said, had been chosen to help with the harvest in ways that city folk wouldn't understand, and their discipline was maintained through traditional methods that had been passed down through generations of farming families. As autumn progressed into winter, the Hendricks began to notice patterns that defied explanation. The children never attended school. Father Michael explained that they were homeschooled through community instruction that took place in the fields and barns where they learned practical skills alongside their letters and numbers. But Betty never saw any actual teaching taking place. Only groups of children working in the grain storage facilities and food processing buildings that seemed to operate around the clock, despite the fact that harvest season was supposed to be over. When she volunteered to help with educational activities, the mothers politely declined, explaining that outsiders weren't yet ready to understand their methods. The children themselves never spoke directly to the Hendricks, but Betty often caught them staring through their windows at night, small faces pressed against the glass like pale moons floating in the darkness. The truth began to emerge when Betty found a child hiding in their barn. One snowy January morning, a girl of perhaps 12, with hollow cheeks and hands that were red and raw from cold and manual labor. The girl begged for food and water, and when Betty brought her inside to warm up, she told a story that made Betty's blood freeze. The children of Gatlin weren't being homeschooled. They were being used as slave labor in an agricultural operation that processed and packaged organic food products for national distribution. The religious framework was simply a control mechanism designed to keep them compliant while they worked 18-hour days sorting, cleaning, and packaging crops in facilities that were never inspected because they were classified as family farms exempt from labor regulations. Children who tried to leave or complained about conditions were sent to reflection cabins in the woods, where they were kept in isolation until they agreed to return to work. Those who persistently resisted disappeared entirely, and their families were told they had been called to serve the harvest in other ways. The girl, whose name was Emma, explained that some of the children weren't even from Gatlin originally. They were foster children and runaways who had been recruited through a network of religious organizations that promised troubled youth a chance to find purpose through agricultural work. Once they arrived, their identification documents were confiscated for safekeeping, and they were told that attempting to leave would result in arrest for theft of community resources. The adult residents were either true believers who genuinely thought they were participating in a divine agricultural mission, or they were financially dependent on the operation and too frightened to speak out. Father Michael controlled everything through a combination of religious manipulation and economic coercion, and he had managed to keep the whole operation hidden by maintaining the facade of a traditional farming community that minded its own business and didn't welcome outside interference. Betty called the Nebraska State Police from the library in the nearest town, pretending she was researching genealogy records while actually using their internet to file reports with Child Protective Services and the Department of Labor. The investigation that followed revealed that the Gatlin operation had been exploiting child labor for over 15 years, generating millions of dollars in profits from organic food contracts while paying the children nothing, and keeping them in conditions that violated every child labor law on the books. Emma's testimony became crucial evidence in building the case, and when law enforcement finally raided the compound, they found over 60 children living in dormitories behind the grain silos, working in facilities that lacked basic safety equipment and medical care. Father Michael and 7 other adults were eventually convicted of conspiracy to commit forced labor, child endangerment, and human trafficking. But by the time the trials concluded, the Hendricks had already left Gatlin forever. They moved back to the Chicago suburbs, where they finally succeeded in adopting 3 children whose previous foster families had been investigated as part of the Gatlin case. Betty still has nightmares about the faces of those children pressed against their windows at night, and she can't drive past cornfields without remembering Emma's skeletal hands and the way she flinched whenever anyone moved too quickly. The farmhouse in Gatlin remains empty, and the town itself has been largely abandoned since the federal investigation exposed the scope of the exploitation that had been hidden behind its pastoral facade. Carl sometimes wonders how many other agricultural communities might be hiding similar operations, using the isolation of rural America and the trust people place in farming families to conceal modern slavery disguised as religious devotion. The Hendricks thought they were moving to a place where they could finally build the family they had always wanted. But instead, they discovered that some American dreams are built on the nightmares of children who have no choice but to serve the harvest until someone brave enough to speak the truth sets them free. Story 4. The American Dream Built on a Chemical Nightmare, Willowbrook Heights. Illinois Captain Marcus Rodriguez had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, survived IED explosions and firefights that would have broken lesser men, but nothing in his military career had prepared him for the war he would fight on American soil. When he returned stateside with his wife Alina and their 2 young children, the VA housing specialist showed them glossy brochures for Willowbrook Heights, a brand new subdivision built specifically for military families transitioning back to civilian life. The developer, Meridian Communities, had partnered with the Department of Veterans Affairs to create what they called Heroes Haven, affordable housing where combat veterans could raise their families in safety and comfort while readjusting to peaceful life. The houses were beautiful, modern colonials, with energy-efficient appliances, manicured lawns, and a community center that offered everything from job training to family counseling services. At $89,000 for a 4-bedroom home with a 2-car garage, it seemed like exactly the kind of fresh start Marcus and Alina had dreamed about during those long nights in Kandahar, when survival felt like an impossible goal. The Rodriguez family moved into 47 Maple Street on a crisp October morning, joining dozens of other military families who had been drawn to Willowbrook Heights by the promise of community, affordability, and the chance to build new lives away from the chaos of deployment cycles. Their neighbors included Marines, Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, and Air Force pilots. Men and women who had sacrificed years of their lives in service to their country, and were finally ready to focus on their families and futures. The subdivision felt like a small slice of the American dream, complete with block parties, little league teams, and the kind of neighborhood watch program that came naturally to people trained in tactical awareness. Marcus found work as a security consultant for a major corporation. Alina enrolled in nursing school, and their children, 7-year-old Sofia and 4-year-old Miguel, adapted quickly to their new elementary school and the pack of military kids who became their instant friends. But within 6 months, the dream began to show cracks that couldn't be repaired with fresh paint or positive thinking. It started with Miguel's persistent nosebleeds, so frequent and severe that Alina had to pick him up from preschool almost daily to take him to the emergency room. The pediatrician initially attributed them to dry air and recommended a humidifier. But when other children in the neighborhood developed similar symptoms, parents began comparing notes at school, pickup, and community events. Sofia complained of constant headaches and had trouble concentrating in class, behavior that was completely unlike her normally focused personality. Alina, who was training to become a nurse and understood medical symptoms better than most, noticed that several of her neighbors had developed skin rashes that wouldn't respond to treatment. And at least 3 families had reported miscarriages within the past year, an unusually high rate for such a small community. The first real warning came from Dr. Patricia Chen, a Navy medic whose family lived 2 streets over from the Rodriguez home. Chen had been conducting informal health surveys as part of her master's thesis on veteran health outcomes, and the data she was collecting from Willowbrook Heights defied everything she knew about medical statistics. Children in the subdivision had respiratory problems at rates nearly 10 times higher than the national average, and adults were developing rare cancers, typically associated with chemical exposure rather than combat stress or normal civilian health issues. When Chen tried to present her findings to the local health department, officials dismissed her concerns as statistical anomalies and suggested that combat veterans might be more sensitive to environmental factors due to stress-related immune system compromises. But Chen knew the difference between psychological symptoms and physical poisoning, and she convinced several families to pay for private environmental testing of their properties. The test results revealed a horror that surpassed anything these veterans had encountered in combat zones. The soil beneath Willowbrook Heights was contaminated with over 40 different industrial chemicals, including benzene, trichloroethylene, and dioxin compounds at levels that exceeded EPA safety standards by factors of hundreds or thousands. The subdivision had been built on top of what had once been the Hartwell Chemical Manufacturing Facility, a World War II-era plant that had produced pesticides, solvents, and chemical weapons components for the military. After the war, the company had simply buried its waste products on site, rather than paying for proper disposal, creating an underground toxic dump that had been leaching poisons into the groundwater for over 60 years. Meridian Communities had purchased the land for a fraction of its market value, knowing about the contamination, but gambling that a basic clay cap and some landscaping would be sufficient to hide the problem long enough to sell all the homes and disappear into bankruptcy protection. The investigation that followed revealed a conspiracy of negligence and greed that reached from local zoning boards to federal housing agencies. Meridian had submitted falsified environmental impact reports that claimed the land had been thoroughly tested and remediated, when in fact no cleanup had ever been attempted. The VA housing program had fast-tracked approval for the development, without conducting independent environmental assessments, eager to provide housing for returning veterans, but unwilling to invest in the due diligence that might have prevented the disaster. Local officials had been bought off with campaign contributions and development fees, and when environmental activists tried to raise concerns about the project during public hearings, their objections were buried in bureaucratic procedures designed to favor developers over community safety. Marcus found himself leading a class action lawsuit that would consume the next 8 years of his life, fighting not just for compensation, but for accountability from the institutions that had betrayed the very people they claimed to serve. The legal battle revealed that Willowbrook Heights was just one of dozens of similar developments built on contaminated land across the country, part of a pattern of environmental racism and veteran exploitation that targeted the most vulnerable populations with the least political power to fight back. Elena's nursing career was derailed by her own health problems. Chronic fatigue and neurological symptoms, consistent with long-term chemical exposure, and both children required ongoing medical treatment for respiratory and developmental issues that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The family was eventually forced to abandon their home, joining hundreds of other military families, who walked away from mortgages on properties that were literally too toxic to inhabit. The settlement, when it finally came, provided enough money for medical expenses and relocation costs, but could never restore the health that had been stolen from an entire community of American heroes. Miguel, now 12, still requires daily medication for chronic asthma and has been diagnosed with learning disabilities that may be permanent. Sophia struggles with anxiety and depression that began when she was 9 years old, and realized that the place her family had thought was safe was actually slowly poisoning them. Marcus and Alina divorced 3 years after leaving Willowbrook Heights. Their marriage, another casualty of the stress and trauma that came from discovering that their own government had used them as unwitting test subjects in an experiment in corporate greed and regulatory capture. The subdivision itself remains empty, surrounded by chain-link fences and warning signs that will stay in place for the next century. While the contamination slowly spreads into surrounding communities that have no idea what's coming for them, Marcus now works as an advocate for veteran housing rights, traveling the country to warn other military families about the environmental hazards that lurk beneath the surface of too good to be true housing deals. He keeps a framed photo on his desk from Willowbrook Heights' first community barbecue, showing dozens of military families gathered around picnic tables with their children, everyone smiling and hopeful about their new beginning. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the greatest betrayals come not from foreign enemies but from the institutions we trust most, and that the American dream can become an American nightmare when profit matters more than the lives of the people who fight to defend it. The toxic legacy of Willowbrook Heights continues to spread through groundwater and legal precedent, a monument to what happens when we forget that some things are too dangerous to bury and too important to ignore. No matter how much money someone is willing to pay to keep the truth hidden beneath a thin layer of contaminated soil. Story 5. The Building That Swallowed Lives. Whittier, Alaska. Rebecca Santos thought she had found the perfect remote work setup when she discovered Begich Towers, a 14-story concrete monolith that housed nearly the entire population of Whittier, Alaska, as a freelance software developer who thrived in isolation. The idea of living in what locals called a city under one roof appealed to her antisocial tendencies and her desire to escape the chaos of Seattle's tech scene. The apartment listings made it sound almost romantic, a self-contained community where neighbors became family, where everything you needed was just an elevator ride away, and where the stunning beauty of Prince William Sound provided a backdrop for the kind of contemplative life she had been craving. At $600 per month for a 2-bedroom unit with mountain views, it seemed like the ultimate digital nomad fantasy, until she realized that fantasy and nightmare often occupy the same psychological space. The building itself was a remnant of Cold War paranoia, originally constructed as military housing for the Whittier Army Port during the 1950s, when Alaska served as America's first line of defense against Soviet invasion. The Army had abandoned the facility in the 1960s, leaving behind a concrete fortress designed to withstand nuclear attack but never intended for long-term civilian habitation. When the city of Whittier incorporated in the 1960s, Begich Towers became the logical solution to housing in a place where winter temperatures dropped to 40 below zero, and hurricane-force winds could last for weeks. The building contained not just apartments but also the post office, city offices, police station, grocery store, laundromat, and medical clinic, everything a person needed to survive without ever stepping outside. For Rebecca, who had spent years feeling overwhelmed by urban crowds and social obligations, it sounded like paradise. The reality became apparent within her first week, when she realized that living in Begich Towers meant existing in a psychological pressure cooker where privacy was impossible, and escape was literally blocked by geography and weather. The building's narrow hallways and thin walls meant that every conversation, every argument, every moment of intimacy became community property, whether residents wanted it or not. Rebecca could hear her upstairs neighbor's television, her next-door neighbor's telephone calls, and the couple across the hall's increasingly violent domestic disputes that no one seemed willing or able to address, because calling the police meant calling someone who lived 3 floors down and had to ride the same elevator as everyone else every day. The communal laundry room became a battlefield where residents passive-aggressively fought over washing machine access and territorial disputes that escalated into feuds lasting months or years. What made the situation truly nightmarish was isolation from the outside world, accessible only by a single-lane tunnel through the mountains that closed during severe weather, which in Alaska meant it could be shut for days or weeks at a time. During her first winter storm in November, Rebecca watched the tunnel close and felt the building's atmosphere shift from merely claustrophobic to genuinely threatening. Residents who had seemed quirky and harmless during good weather began displaying the psychological symptoms of people trapped in a confined space with no possibility of escape: paranoia, aggression, depression, and the kind of cabin fever that transforms normal human interactions into potential violence. The building's management, such as it was, consisted of a part-time caretaker who lived on the ground floor and spent most of his time drunk, leaving residents to police themselves through informal hierarchies that favored long-term residents over newcomers and men over women. By January, Rebecca had stopped leaving her apartment except for absolute necessities, ordering groceries through the building's primitive delivery system, and conducting all her work meetings through video calls that she scheduled around the building's frequent power outages and internet failures. The psychological isolation was made worse by the physical reality of Alaskan winter, when daylight lasted only a few hours and the building's fluorescent lighting created a perpetual twilight that distorted sleep cycles and contributed to the seasonal affective disorder that plagued nearly every resident. She began hearing voices in the ventilation system, conversations that might have been real or might have been hallucinations brought on by the combination of social isolation, vitamin D deficiency, and the constant stress of living in a place where personal space was measured in square feet rather than acres. The breaking point came during a March blizzard that closed the tunnel for 11 consecutive days, trapping the building's 272 residents in what had become a concrete prison with no possibility of outside intervention. A dispute over thermostat settings escalated into a physical altercation that left one resident hospitalized and the building's fragile social contract completely shattered. Rebecca barricaded herself in her apartment as groups of residents roamed the hallways, looking for scapegoats to blame for everything, from noise complaints to food shortages. And she realized that she was experiencing something very close to what prisoners in solitary confinement describe: the complete breakdown of normal psychological defenses, when escape becomes impossible and human contact becomes a source of threat rather than comfort. When the tunnel finally reopened, Rebecca called 911 and reported what amounted to a mental health emergency, explaining to dispatchers that she was trapped in a building with nearly 300 people who were displaying symptoms of collective psychological breakdown. The Alaska State Troopers who responded found her in a state of acute anxiety and paranoia that required immediate medical intervention, and she was airlifted to Anchorage for psychiatric evaluation and treatment. The doctors who treated her explained that what she had experienced was a well-documented phenomenon among people trapped in isolated communities during extreme weather, a form of collective psychosis that occurs when normal social structures break down and individuals lose their sense of personal agency and safety. Rebecca never returned to Whittier or to her apartment in Bagich Towers, forfeiting her security deposit and leaving behind most of her possessions rather than risk re-entering what she now recognized as a psychological trap disguised as affordable housing. She moved back to Seattle, where she now pays 3 times as much for a studio apartment, but considers it a bargain compared to the price she paid for learning that isolation and community are not the same thing, and that the human need for connection cannot be satisfied by simple proximity to other humans who are equally trapped and desperate. The building continues to house most of Whittier's population, and while city officials promote it as a unique tourist attraction and model of sustainable Arctic living, Rebecca knows the truth that visitors don't see during their brief summer tours: that Bagich Towers is less a city under one roof than it is a monument to what happens when architectural solutions are applied to human problems without considering the psychological cost of treating People like inventory to be stored rather than individuals who need space to breathe and grow and escape when the walls start closing in. The software she developed during her months in Whittier, a project management system designed for remote teams, became hugely successful and made her financially independent. But she has never been able to work on anything related to building management or community planning without experiencing panic attacks that require medication to control. Rebecca now advocates for mental health resources in isolated communities and has testified before Congress about the psychological dangers of housing policies that prioritize cost savings over human well-being. But she still wakes up sometimes, in the middle of the night, feeling like she's back in that concrete tower, listening to the ventilation system carry the voices of people who are slowly going insane from the simple act of trying to live too close together in a place where winter lasts forever and escape is always just one storm away from becoming impossible. Story 6. Where the Past Never Died. Vidor, Texas. James and Maria Washington thought they had finally found their slice of the American dream when James received a job offer from Beaumont Chemical that would double his salary and provide the kind of financial stability their mixed-race family had been chasing since their wedding day. The position came with relocation assistance and a company recommendation for Vidor, Texas, a small town just 20 miles from the refinery, where James would work as a safety engineer. The real estate agent, a cheerful white woman named Susan who spoke in honeyed southern drawls about family values and traditional community spirit, showed them a charming 3-bedroom ranch house on Magnolia Street with a white picket fence and mature oak trees that would provide perfect shade for their 8-year-old daughter, Zoe, and 6-year-old son, Marcus, to play beneath. At $127,000. The house cost half what they would have paid for something similar in Houston, and the neighborhood looked like something from a 1950s television show. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained lawns, and the kind of front porches where neighbors still waved at each other while watering their gardens. What Susan hadn't mentioned, and what James and Maria wouldn't discover until after they had signed the mortgage papers and moved their belongings into their new home, was that Vidor had earned a reputation as one of the most notoriously racist communities in America. A sundown town where black families understood they needed to be gone before dark or face consequences that local law enforcement would be slow to investigate. The town's history was written in violence and intimidation that stretched back generations, from the Ku Klux Klan rallies of the 1920s to the more recent efforts by white supremacist groups to maintain what they called the racial purity of their community. James's new colleagues at Beaumont Chemical had assumed he understood this history when they offered him the position. But corporate HR policies prevented them from explicitly discussing racial demographics during the recruitment process, leaving James and Maria to discover the truth through experience rather than warning. The first signs came within days of their arrival, when neighbors who had initially waved politely from their driveways began finding reasons to avoid eye contact when the Washington family walked past. Anonymous notes appeared in their mailbox, not overtly threatening at first, but making it clear that their presence had been noticed and was unwelcome. The messages started with passive-aggressive observations about property values and community standards before escalating to more direct language about how certain types of families might be happier in other neighborhoods where they could be with their own kind. When Maria took Zoe and Marcus to the community pool, conversations stopped and families began packing up their belongings and leaving, creating an eerie silence that made the children uncomfortable enough to ask why everyone seemed angry at them. The pool manager, a thin man with nervous eyes, explained that the facility was experiencing maintenance issues and would be closing early. But Maria could see the other families resettling at a different pool across town, where the Washington children wouldn't be welcome. The harassment escalated when someone spray-painted racial slurs across their garage door in the middle of the night, using language so vile that James had to take time off work to repaint before Zoe and Marcus could see what had been written about their family. When he reported the vandalism to the Vidor Police Department, the desk sergeant took his statement with the kind of bureaucratic disinterest that suggested this was neither the first nor the most serious incident they had dealt with. And Detective Ray Collins, who was assigned to investigate, made it clear that he considered the Washingtons partially responsible for the problems they were experiencing. Collins suggested that James might want to consider whether his family would be more comfortable in a community that was better suited to their lifestyle. And when Maria asked what he meant by that, Collins simply shrugged and said that some places had traditions that went back generations and weren't easily changed by newcomers, who didn't understand local customs. The situation became genuinely terrifying when someone began following Maria to work and back, always staying just far enough behind to avoid direct confrontation, but close enough to make it clear that her movements were being monitored and recorded. The children reported being pushed around on the school playground by older kids who called them names that Marcus was too young to understand, but that left Zoe crying every afternoon when James picked them up. Teachers and administrators at Vidor Elementary seemed determined to treat these incidents as normal childhood conflicts, rather than racially motivated harassment. And when Maria demanded a meeting with the principal to discuss the pattern of abuse her children were experiencing, she was told that the school couldn't be held responsible for teaching tolerance to families who chose to live in communities where they didn't quite fit in naturally. The final straw came when James discovered a flyer tucked under his windshield wiper announcing a Heritage Pride rally scheduled for the following Saturday in the empty lot directly across from their house. The flyer featured Confederate flag imagery and rhetoric about defending traditional American values against outside agitators who want to destroy our way of life. And while it didn't mention the Washington family by name, the timing and location made it clear that their presence in Vidor had triggered a coordinated response from organized white supremacist groups who saw their mixed-race family as a threat to the racial hierarchy they had spent decades maintaining. When James called the police to report what appeared to be an organized intimidation campaign targeting his family, Detective Collins informed him that the rally was perfectly legal under First Amendment protections, and that the Vidor Police Department would be providing security to ensure that participants could exercise their constitutional rights without interference from outside agitators. James contacted the Houston office of the NAACP, whose civil rights lawyers had been dealing with Vidor-related cases for decades, and immediately recognized the pattern of escalating harassment that typically preceded more serious violence. Attorney Patricia Williams explained that Vidor had been the subject of multiple federal investigations for civil rights violations, but that prosecuting individual cases was difficult because local law enforcement and judicial systems were often complicit in maintaining the racial intimidation that kept the community segregated. She arranged for the Washington family to be relocated to a safe house in Houston, while federal investigators decided whether the harassment they had experienced constituted a hate crime worthy of federal prosecution. But she warned them that even if charges were filed, returning to Vidor would never be safe for their children. The Washingtons lost their house, James's job, and most of their savings in the process of escaping Vidor, but they consider themselves fortunate compared to other families who had tried to integrate the community over the years and had faced violence that left them physically and psychologically scarred for life. The Heritage Pride rally took place as scheduled, drawing over 200 participants from across East Texas, who gathered to celebrate what organizers called a victory for traditional values, and to warn other minority families about the consequences of trying to force integration on communities that preferred to maintain their historical character. Local media coverage of the event focused on First Amendment issues rather than the racist ideology that had driven the Washington family from their home. And Vidor continues to maintain its reputation as a place where certain families understand they are not welcome regardless of their education, income, or contributions to the community. James eventually found work with a different chemical company in a more diverse area of Texas. But the psychological damage from their Vidor experience required years of family therapy and has left lasting impacts on both children's sense of safety and belonging in their own country. Zoe, now 16, has developed anxiety and trust issues that affect her ability to form friendships, and Marcus still asks his parents whether they will have to move again if neighbors decide they don't belong in whatever community they call home. Maria has become an advocate for fair housing rights and has testified before Congress about the ongoing reality of sundown towns in modern America. But she knows that Vidor represents just one example of communities across the country where the ghosts of historical racism continue to terrorize families who believe that the American dream should be available to everyone regardless of race or ethnicity. The house on Magnolia Street remains empty, its white picket fence now weathered, and broken, serving as a monument to the hatred that can lurk beneath the surface of America's most innocent-looking neighborhoods. Real estate listings for the property no longer mention the excellent schools or family-friendly community, and local agents have learned to steer minority families toward other areas where their children might be able to play in their own backyards, without fear of harassment from neighbors who still believe that some people don't deserve the same rights and freedoms that others take for granted in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Story 7. When Silicon Valley Money Killed a Town's Soul, Nevada City. California Sarah Chen had taught third grade at Deer Creek Elementary for 16 years, watching 3 generations of Nevada City families send their children through her classroom in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. She had chosen this life deliberately, small-town teaching in a community where everyone knew each other's names, where parent-teacher conferences happened at the grocery store, and where her modest teacher's salary of $47,000 was enough to rent a charming Victorian cottage just 2 blocks from the school where she had dedicated her career to educating the children of loggers, shop owners, and retirees who had built their lives around the rhythm of seasonal festivals and community. Nevada City felt like the last authentic place in California, a gold rush town that had preserved its historic character through careful planning and fierce local pride, where the biggest controversy in recent memory had been whether to allow a Starbucks on Broad Street. But authenticity, Sarah would learn, becomes a luxury commodity when tech millionaires discover it, and communities built on generations of shared struggle can be dismantled in a matter of months by people who mistake scenery for soul. The invasion began subtly, with out-of-state license plates appearing in the Safeway parking lot and unfamiliar faces at the farmer's market, who photographed everything instead of buying anything. By 2019, San Francisco tech executives had discovered that Nevada City offered the perfect combination of small-town charm and high-speed internet infrastructure, making it an ideal location for remote work arrangements that allowed them to maintain Silicon Valley salaries while enjoying what they called authentic mountain living. Real estate agents from the Bay Area began hosting weekend tours for tech families looking to escape urban chaos, marketing Nevada City as a place where children could ride bikes unsupervised, and where million-dollar bonuses could buy entire historic neighborhoods rather than cramped condominiums. The marketing materials featured photographs of local festivals and community events, selling the culture and traditions that longtime residents had built over decades as amenities for wealthy newcomers who had no intention of participating in the civic engagement that had created the very authenticity they were purchasing. Sarah first noticed the changes when her landlord, Mrs. Patterson, who had rented the cottage to Sarah for 8 years at below-market rates because she believed teachers deserved community support, received an offer from a tech executive to buy the property for triple its assessed value. Mrs. Patterson apologized through tears as she explained that her husband's medical bills had exhausted their retirement savings and that selling to the highest bidder was their only option for avoiding bankruptcy. But she promised to give Sarah plenty of time to find alternative housing. What Mrs. Patterson didn't understand was that alternative housing no longer existed in Nevada City at prices a teacher could afford. Every rental property had been converted to Airbnb listings or purchased by remote workers whose tech salaries made them impossible competition for local families who had lived in the community for generations. Within 18 months, Sarah watched her community transform from a working-class mountain town into what locals began calling Disneyland for tech bros, a playground where wealthy outsiders could cosplay small-town life while their economic power displaced the very people who had created the culture they claimed to value. The historic Broad Street that had once housed family-owned businesses was taken over by artisanal coffee shops, boutique galleries, and restaurants, serving $28 entrees to customers who complained that Nevada City lacked the dining sophistication they were accustomed to in Palo Alto. Local business owners who had served the community for decades found themselves unable to afford rent increases that landlords justified by pointing to what tech tenants were willing to pay for authentic mountain retail experiences, and longtime residents began commuting to jobs in Sacramento. Because service industry work in their own hometown no longer paid enough to cover housing costs, the psychological impact on the community was devastating in ways that economic statistics couldn't capture. Sarah's students began disappearing. Mid-semester, as their families were forced to relocate to Central Valley towns, where housing costs hadn't yet been inflated by tech money, breaking apart friend groups and extended family networks that had provided stability for children whose parents worked seasonal jobs or struggled with the economic uncertainty that had always been part of mountain life. The annual Midsummer Mozart Festival, which had been organized by volunteers for 30 years, was canceled when the organizing committee discovered that none of them could afford to live in Nevada City anymore, and the community center that had hosted everything from A meetings to quinceañera celebrations was sold to developers who converted it into luxury townhomes. Marketed as historic Nevada City, living to buyers who had no connection to the history they were purchasing. The final insult came during a city council meeting where tech newcomers, who had lived in Nevada City for less than 2 years, began demanding changes to local ordinances that had preserved the community's character for generations. They wanted expanded parking for their Tesla vehicles, complained that local festivals were too noisy and attracted undesirable visitors from other counties, and proposed hiring private security firms to patrol neighborhoods where they had purchased million-dollar properties, when longtime residents tried to explain that these festivals and community events were the foundation of Nevada City's identity. They were dismissed as change-resistant and economically backward by people who had made their fortunes disrupting other communities and saw no irony in moving to Nevada City, specifically because of its resistance to the kind of change they were now demanding. Sarah found herself living in her car during the final months of the school year, showering at the gym and grading papers by flashlight, while searching for affordable housing within commuting distance of Deer Creek Elementary. The emotional toll of watching her community die while trying to maintain normalcy for her students pushed her into depression that required medication and therapy she couldn't afford. On a teacher's salary, in a town where therapy sessions cost more than her monthly car payment, when the school district offered her a transfer to a Sacramento elementary school, she realized that staying in Nevada City meant choosing between her mental health and her commitment to the children who needed stability during their own families' displacement trauma. The irony was that the tech executives who had colonized Nevada City quickly became bored with the small-town life. They had purchased and began spending most of their time in San Francisco or traveling to other locations, leaving behind empty houses that sat dark most nights while families who had lived in the community for generations remained homeless or relocated to trailer parks an hour away. The authentic community culture that had attracted the newcomers in the first place died when the people who had created it could no longer afford to participate in it, leaving behind a hollow simulacrum of small-town life where houses stood empty while the elementary school struggled to maintain enrollment as families continued fleeing the economic violence of gentrification. Sarah now teaches in Stockton, where she rents a studio apartment for twice what she had paid for the Nevada City cottage and commutes through traffic that adds 2 hours to her daily schedule. She drives past Nevada City occasionally on weekend trips to visit friends who moved even further into the mountains, and she sees the historic downtown that looks exactly the same from the outside, but feels completely different, like a movie set where someone forgot to hire actors to play the community members. The boutique shops close early because there aren't enough local customers to sustain them, and the restaurants that replaced longtime local businesses struggle to find workers because no one can afford to live close enough to walk to work in a town where median home prices have tripled in 5 years. The most heartbreaking casualty has been the children who were forced to leave their schools, friends, and extended families because their parents could no longer afford to live in the communities where they had been born and raised. Sarah stays in touch with some of her former students through social media and sees how displacement has affected their sense of identity and belonging. Children who once felt rooted in a place with deep history and strong community connections now struggle with the transience and isolation of families who must move wherever housing costs allow them to survive. The tech executives who triggered this displacement have largely moved on to colonize other authentic communities, leaving behind a Nevada City that looks prosperous on real estate websites, but has lost the soul that made it worth preserving in the first place. The final insult came when one of the tech executives, who had helped destroy Nevada City's community fabric, published a blog post about sustainable rural development and preserving authentic American culture. using photographs of the very festivals and traditions that had died when the people who created them were priced out of their own hometown. Sarah printed the blog post and keeps it in her desk drawer as a reminder that some forms of violence wear masks of progress and prosperity, and that the American dream can become an American nightmare when economic power is used as a weapon against the communities that dare to exist outside the boundaries of what wealthy people consider acceptable or convenient. Nevada City remains on the map, but the town that Sarah loved and served for 16 years exists now only in the memories of displaced families who understand that you can't buy authenticity. You can only destroy it by treating other people's homes and histories as products for your own consumption.